The popular YouTube channel Crash Course, which is known for taking popular topics and oversimplifying them so that busy hipsters can watch a 10-minute video about a topic and are given the false impression they actually know what they're talking about when they lecture someone at Starbucks, decided to tackle the topic of intelligent design. And after watching how terrible it was, I felt compelled to respond to the ridiculously lopsided, grossly inaccurate, and poorly researched video that they made. So let's start by playing through a minute or two of the video and talk about the arguments that they think they made.
Paley used it to talk about God in what's known as the Watchmaker analogy. He asked us to imagine what we would think if we found a watch on the ground. Would we imagine that the watch simply appeared randomly, spontaneously on its own? Or would we see the complexity of it and notice that its parts seemed to come together in a particular way in order to accomplish a goal? If so, wouldn't we think that the watch must have been made by someone on purpose? Paley was arguing that the teleology demonstrated by a watch would lead us to conclude that it was designed by an intelligent creator with a particular end in mind. Teleological means goal-oriented or purposeful, and we can easily pick out the teleology of man-made objects. Continued his analogy by comparing a watch to a living organism. Look at the complexity of the human body. Heart and lungs working together, producing sweat to keep ourselves from overheating, transforming food into energy. We're just generally amazing all around. Look at how elements of the natural world operate according to complex laws that sustain a beautiful natural harmony. Paley said that this couldn't possibly just have happened any more than the design of a pocket watch could just have happened. There must be a designer. If you accept this analogy, then you agree with Paley that just like the purposefulness of a watch compels us to believe in a watchmaker, the purposefulness of the world compels us to believe in a world maker, God. And you might think this is a fantastic argument. It might even be what motivates your own belief in God. But some of you probably aren't buying it, and you know what to do. Arguments are refuted by counter-arguments, so when you want to refute an argument by analogy, you offer a disanalogy. Basically, you demonstrate that situation A and situation B are dissimilar enough that the analogy doesn't actually work. So, to object to Paley, we have to identify a way in which elements of the natural world, like human bodies, are relevantly dissimilar to watches.
Okay, so here he lays down the ground rules. He's very clear that what he's going to do is not prove why he's right. The purpose of the video is to counter the arguments in favor of intelligent design. So his first mistake here, he's setting up his argument like it's a criminal case. And all he has to do is discredit some of the evidence to win. So by treating this like a criminal case, he's under the illusion that all he has to do is prove that the glove doesn't fit, so you must acquit. Even if you deceivingly convince people that the glove doesn't fit, that doesn't actually prove there was another killer. Even though O.J. Simpson's defense team was able to deceive jurors into believing the glove doesn't fit, he was still the most likely killer. And the two people killed probably just didn't die randomly. So he's using teleology and the watchmaker example to try and prove that it isn't perfect. And if he can make that case and argue that it isn't perfect, then somehow that makes the case wrong. The watchmaker analogy is actually a really good one, and he doesn't prove it wrong at all. But it's important to understand what he's trying to do here. Actually, a philosophical argument is more like a civil case, where you don't have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. All you have to do is prove that which scenario is more likely to have occurred, and of course, O.J. Simpson was found guilty in civil court.
When we're talking about a watch, an objector might say, it obviously had a creator. After all, we can take it apart and see clearly how the gears fit together and move the hands and keep time. But there's so much in the natural world that isn't understandable in the same way. For instance, why would God have designed our eyes to have a blind spot?
So he brings up an old eye argument. This argument is called dysteleology, which refers to apparent poor design in the biological and physical world. In other words, if there are flaws and imperfections in the world, then we have to attribute those flaws and imperfections to the designer. And the implication is an imperfect design means there's an imperfect God. Here's the basic argument of the eyes being poorly designed the authors are describing in the video. We would have to wonder why an intelligent designer placed the neural wiring of the retina on the side facing the incoming light. This arrangement scatters the light, making our vision less detailed than it might be, and even produces a blind spot at the point that the wiring is pulled through the light-sensitive retina to produce the optic nerve that carries visual images to the brain. Other scientists like Richard Dawkins have called the retina stupidly designed, but Dr. Stephen Meyer adds, there's an important physiological reason as to why the retina has been inverted in the eye. Within the overall design of this system, it's a trade-off that allows the eye to process the vast amounts of oxygen it needs in vertebrates. Yes, this creates a slight blind spot, but that's not a problem because people have two eyes, and the two blind spots don't overlap. Actually, the eye is an incredible design. Another biologist writes, the vertebrae retina provides an excellent example of functional, though non-intuitive design. The design of the retina is responsible for its high acuity and sensitivity. It is simply untrue that the retina is demonstrably suboptimal, nor is it easy to conceive how it might be modified without significantly decreasing its function. The dysteleology argument is looking at the design and pointing out one parameter and saying it's bad and that it could have been designed better, but sometimes the picture changes when you understand the whole structure. Engineers know that all designs require optimizing a full suite of parameters, and so trade-offs are inevitable to create the best overall overall solution. You could look at a laptop and say the screen should be bigger or it should have more memory. Sure, they could do that, but then it would be less portable or be more expensive. Or you could look at a dump truck and say, this dump truck is poorly designed because it's not that agile and doesn't turn very easily. Again, it's a trade-off. If you want size and power, then you need a bigger engine, which requires the truck to be bigger, which is detrimental to its agility. That's a trade-off being made in the design, not a flaw. So there are inevitable trade-offs and compromises. Each individual part might be criticized for being suboptimal, but that's not the issue. The real issue is how well it functions overall. That's how good engineering works. So when you consider the blind spot doesn't really matter when you have two eyes, it almost seems like an intelligent designer realized there was a blind spot and so he added a second eye.
Paley responded that it doesn't matter whether we can understand how something was created, the point is simply that it was. He might point out, for instance, that I actually don't understand the inner workings of my phone, but I still know it had a creator. Whether or not I understand how it was created is beside the point. Next objection, some parts of nature seem to be without purpose. A blind spot obviously doesn't have any function, and neither do nipples on a man. Paley's response here was, just because you don't know there's a purpose doesn't mean there isn't one. But this is a problem too, because his whole argument for believing in God is that you should look at the world and see purpose. So if we see some things in the world that are working great and really seem to have complexity and definite use and others that don't, that's a flaw in his argument. What's more, the absence of any obvious purpose in things can lead people to start searching for purposes, effectively making them up. For instance, I could find a purpose for this finger. I could use it as a nose picker. It would make a good one. It's just the right size to really get in there and dig around, but was my finger designed to pick noses? Probably not.
Okay, so first he says that assuming the world isn't random, that there are purposes for things can lead to people making them up, falsely attributing purposes when there are none. But what he's saying is that if we're the ones creating purpose, then purposes are purely subjective and cannot be proven. So he could argue the reason we have fingers is just as likely for nose picking as it is for any other hypothesis, because any purpose we can come up with is purely subjective and cannot be proven. This argument has a lot of problems. One in circular reasoning, because he's already starting from the point that there are no purposes, so no amount of evidence could possibly prove there to be a purpose because it's all subjective. So if nothing has a purpose, then one could argue the reason I have legs is not to give me mobility, but to kick my sister in the head. That would be a valid argument if you believe nothing have a purpose. But if you think the world is not purposeless because we have seasons and tides and systems and laws of the universe that are consistent and repeatable, and consistent and repeatable systems are typically the hallmark of organization, and organization is something that we as humans with intelligent minds use when we create things, then you're most likely to determine that the purpose of my legs is not to kick my sister in the head, but to give me mobility. But he's coming from a stance that has to reject all practicality and evidence.
20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell made fun of this purpose-finding tendency by pointing out that you could look at a bunny and form the belief that God gave it a fuzzy white tail so hunters would have something to shoot at. The point is, if we're the ones inventing purposes rather than recognizing ones that are inherently there, then we're the real creators of purpose in the world, not God. Basically, if you believe that God made eyes for seeing, then you also have to believe that he designed fingers as nose pickers and rabbit tails as bullseyes and blind spots as ways for us to get into car accidents. So the counter-argument here is we don't just get to pick and choose and say God designed the stuff we want him to have designed and not the other stuff.
So what he does right here is refuse to distinguish between conscious choices and things we don't make choices about. Picking his nose may be a conscious choice, but seeing his eyes when they're open is not a conscious choice. They just see. He finishes by saying we don't just get to pick and choose that God designed the stuff we wanted him designed and not the other stuff. But he's grouping conscious choices with things that we have no control over. I didn't choose to have eyes or legs, and attributing any reason for how I use them to discredit the argument for why they're there in the first place is ridiculous, and only something you'd possibly believe if you first believed that nothing had a purpose. Again, circular reasoning. For example, if I were to go out in the middle of nowhere and find a contraption that looked like this, and I were to take it apart and use the metal pieces to hit someone with, since this thing was out in the middle of nowhere, and I have no way of knowing who built it or why it's there, by his line of argument, you can't prove this contraption was built for playing basketball, and it's just as likely that it was created as a device to hit somebody with, because we don't just get to pick and choose purposes for why things exist, because any conscious choice, or how the device is used, is just as good as any other for the purpose of its existence in the first place. But there's a reason he makes these type of arguments. This video has philosophy in the title because the authors are trying very hard to wall themselves off from any scientific objections. He's sticking to the philosophy because the belief that things aren't random is the basis for the existence of science. The greatest scientists from centuries ago were all theists because they believed in God, they believed things weren't random and had a purpose, and their objective was to figure out why things operated the way that they do. What's inherent in all of the science is the belief that we don't live in a reasonless, lawless, purposeless, baseless place where everything would be chaotic and inconsistent and it would be impossible to test. And you can't have scientific theory if nothing can be repeated or tested. So by setting up this wall, any evidence you bring to the table can be rejected because it's all subjective. What he's doing here is putting himself in a position to say to anything, you can't prove that.
Rather than searching for disanalogies, another way Paley's argument has been countered is with an alternative explanation for condition B. Paley says that bodies are purposeful, and from there concludes that the purpose had to have been put there by an intelligent creator. But another explanation for how bodies came to have the complexity and functionality they have today is natural selection and random mutation.
Okay, again, the author's just pretending everything he says is true, and the world as we know it is just some random, unguided process that just worked perfectly for us and we're just that lucky. But there's a big problem here, because before you even get to natural selection, a lot of things have to happen first. You need the Big Bang to happen precisely the way it did, which is enormously improbable. But 2, evolution by natural selection can only happen once there are living things already in existence. And in order to have living organisms, you need information. Specifically, you need DNA. The recent emergence of the complexity of DNA and the processes involved in the replication of DNA and protein folding have caused alarm for evolutionists, even causing former mainstream evolutionists like Anthony Flew and Dean Kenyon to conclude that the complexity of DNA coding can only have arrived by intelligence and not by chance. Even the co-founder of DNA, Francis Crick, who served as a code breaker in World War II, noticed the incredible complexity, and his expertise in sequence coding helped him realize the structure of DNA didn't come by chance, it's clearly a designed sequence. But since evolutionists are committed to never acknowledging God no matter what the evidence says, Crick, along with Richard Dawkins, turned to a new explanation. It must be aliens.
What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry and molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
What's important here is that even the most ardent evolutionists admit that DNA must be created by an intelligent mind. So Richard Dawkins and Francis Crick were both admitting that they believe in intelligent design. The only difference being, instead of concluding that God must be the designer, it was aliens.
We can concede that the existence of a designer god helped make sense of the origins of the world in a pre-scientific age, but now we have a perfectly good scientific explanation for how the complexity of the world came about. So who needs a watchmaker when you have evolution by natural selection?
Okay, so he says 2 things here. First, he says, while people a long time ago believed in intelligent design, what's old is bad and what's new is cool, and we're way too smart to believe in that now. I mean, it's not even trending on BuzzFeed or anything.
Now, the idea of a grand designer is certainly old, but the important question to ask is whether or not it is true. Simply to say it is old can give the erroneous impression that what is old is necessarily false and has been superseded. Secondly, it can give the further erroneous impression that no one holds it today. But some of the finest minds in science, at least one Nobel Prize winner in physics, does hold it.
The second thing he says is who needs a watchmaker when you have evolution by natural selection? But again, he's skipping over a lot of important steps. Before you even get to natural selection, you need a self-replicating organism with enormous amounts of specified information that's in their DNA. But again, the goal of the video isn't to objectively cover the topic, only to attack the other side. And in order to do that in a 10-minute video, you have to skip a lot more details that might cause people to ask questions that could collapse their argument.
Another objection to Paley's case came from the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, who pointed out that if we're to take the analogy seriously, we'd need to conclude that the creator that Paley posits seems to make a lot of mistakes. And not just blind spots, like how about hurricanes? Or why would he make bodies with certain tissues, like in the breast, prostate, or colon, that are so incredibly prone to cancer? Why would he make umbilical cords that could wrap around a baby's neck? Why would he make butterflies have to wait for hours immobile for their wings to dry as soon as they come out of their chrysalis, making them easy prey for predators?
Again, this is the same argument as before, disteleology, where he points out the imperfections into why an intelligent designer can exist. But this could go on forever. Why would he design water? Because people could drown in it. Why would he make the sun? Because people can overheat and die. Why would he make gravity? Because people can fall down. Why are there any negative to anything ever? The author uses specific examples like why have umbilical cords because babies can strangle. Well, the umbilical cord carries oxygen and nutrients from the placenta into your baby's bloodstream. And considering there's almost 7 billion people on the planet, it seems like it's going okay. Or, what's the purpose of hurricanes? Well, scientists have a reason for that too, and here it is. You can pause the video and read the whole thing if you want to, but it sounds like the purpose of hurricanes are to regulate the global temperature. But of course, the authors of the video reject all scientific theories because all conclusions are only subjective interpretations that cannot be proven, so it really doesn't matter what evidence you have against them.
Hume pointed out that the world is chock full of stuff that looks cruel, ridiculous, impractical, and contrary to life. A flawed world, he said, implies a flawed creator. Now, the development of evolutionary biology over the past couple hundred years has taken a pretty heavy toll on the teleological argument, but it still has many supporters, and their method for defending their view is a good model for the way the Socratic method is supposed to work. When opponents raise objections to your theory, you need to either reject it or modify it in a way that responds to those objections.
Okay, he's just sticking to the argument tactics here and making it sound like it's the argument style that's creating this belief in intelligent design and not all the evidence that supports it. What's sneaky here is that he uses the word modify, and you'll see him use it again. And by doing this, he's trying to create the perception that science has proven intelligent design wrong already, and now intelligent design are trying to change their stance. That is not the case at all. But it's important to recognize what he's doing, because he's using language as if it assumes his side has already been proven to be right and the other side has conceded defeat. And you'll see where he's getting this from right here.
So, supporters of the teleological argument set out to modify and strengthen their view. Here are a couple modern responses. Contemporary British philosopher Richard Swinburne gives us a modern teleological argument with a twist of probability. He says that even if there's another possible explanation for the universe, we should go with the explanation that's most likely to be true. And he says that it's simply more probable that God designed the world than that it came about through the pure chance of evolutionary processes.
Okay, so he uses the word modify again because he's trying to make it seem like advocates for intelligent design have changed their stance and have now pivoted to alternative argument tactics. That is not what's happened. All that has happened is that now intelligent design has more proof that they're right, and bringing up new scientific proof isn't pivoting or changing their stance. It's strengthening their argument with facts. Then he brings up Richard Swinburne, who's saying that as a scientist, even if he's 99.99% positive that you're wrong, he has to acknowledge that there's a possibility that he's wrong, no matter how sure he is. But just to prove how ridiculous a randomly organized universe created out of nothing is, what he's saying is even if it was possible, which is enormously improbable, then the more likely scenario is the world appears to be designed because it was. But the author's spinning this like he's admitting that his argument is flawed and now he's adding a twist of probability. But that's not true. For example, if I'm watching football with a friend and he says, if I were a little bit faster, I would be the best player in the NFL, and I were to reply, even if you were fast, you'd still suck. That's not me conceding he's correct. And I'm adding a twist of probability. That's me saying, you're an idiot, but hypothetically, even if you were faster, you'd still be wrong. That's just how improbable your argument is. And here he'll move on to the fine-tuning argument.
Likewise, another class of modern defenses of the teleological argument are collectively known as fine-tuning arguments. These arguments accept the Big Bang and evolution as scientific truths.
No, that is incorrect. The authors of the video continuously make the mistake of linking the improbability of the creation of the universe and an evolutionary theory. These are two different things. The fine-tuning argument, which he's about to speak of, isn't talking evolutionary theory. Fine-tuning is mainly about the prerequisites needed to support any life at all, whether it be created or through evolution. Because when the Big Bang happens, there isn't life yet, and there's extremely precise things that have to happen in order for the universe to be able to sustain life.
These are numbers like the mass, the weight of an electron, the weight of a quark, the strength of gravity, the strength of the electromagnetic field. About 20 numbers that describe those and other parameters, features of our world, but nobody knows why it is that those numbers have the particular values that they do. Now, you could easily say, yeah, who really cares? You change the mass of the electron by a little bit more, a little bit less. Does it really matter? And the answer is it does. See, it turns out that if you imagine that we had 20 dials right here, and we could fiddle with those 20 numbers at will, even a small change to the values of the known values of those numbers would cause the world as we know it to disappear.
Which suggests that the universe actually may have a purpose, and some physicists are now suggesting it does have a purpose. And this has come out of some findings about the some of the fundamental numbers in atomic physics.
Bernard Carr is a cosmologist and studies how the laws of physics operate in the universe. He says that the laws of nature are so finely tuned to enable complex life to exist that it is extremely unlikely that this could have happened by chance. Such fine-tuning, Carr believes, at least raises the possibility of a tuner.
For example, if we go back to, say, 1 second after the Big Bang, at that point the expansion rate and the mass density have to have been adjusted to each other just right so that the universe is just at this critical point. If the universe at that point were expanding just 1 part in the 15th decimal place faster, the universe would have flown apart without galaxies ever having had a chance to form. On the other hand, if the expansion rate were just a little slower than what we think by change of 1 in the 15th decimal place, then the universe would in fact have expanded to a maximum size and collapsed. We would never have even reached the time in the universe at which we're living.
So it's not talking evolutionary theory, it's talking about what needs to happen in order for life to exist in any form at all. In essence, fine-tuning isn't talking about the crops that are grown on the farm, but the conditions necessary to grow any crops at all. Now he'll go into this and separate the two briefly, but this is very important because he sneakily ties these things together as if they're the same.
But they maintain that for the evolution of life to occur, it's most likely that God set up the precise conditions that it required, rather than them coming about by accident. After all, if Earth were just a little closer to or farther from the sun, if the composition of the atmosphere was slightly different, if the content of our oceans was something other than what it is, life would have never taken root. A lot of people think these modernized arguments have more going for them than Paley's did. This is partly because these types of teleologists have moved from making assertions about certainty to making claims about probability, which seem easier to get right and to defend.
So the author is asserting that the belief in intelligent design has pivoted to science and probability because it's easier to defend. That isn't true. It's that intelligent design supporters realize that they aren't going to get through to people who aren't religious by using the Bible as justification for intelligent design, so they need to use a more neutral language, like science, to make people realize how improbable a random universe is. So the video continues to try and reject any and all scientific evidence that disputes their claims, and positions the usage of science against them as somehow admitting defeat, when intelligent design is actually strengthening their claims by showing scientifically how enormously improbable a random, unguided universe is.
Objectors will counter by saying that the problem with these arguments is you can't really make a probability claim when you only have a sample set of 1. If we had multiple Earths that we could examine, we could see how likely any particular adaptation is or how unique the conditions for life are. Then we would know if it were likely or unlikely to happen without God. But we can't know that, at least not now, because we can only access this one world where we know that things evolved as they did.
Again, he links fine-tuning and evolution as if they're the same, which they are not, and then says we can't test how likely the creation of the universe is and how likely a beneficial random genetic mutation could be because we only have a sample set of 1 and we can't test it. But that's not necessarily true either. It's called mathematics, and scientists can calculate the odds of certain things happening that we haven't seen yet. For example, if I was in a casino and playing roulette and picked the right number 100,000 times in a row, even though that hasn't happened yet, the odds of that happening can be calculated, and we know that getting the right number 100,000 times in a row is so improbable that it's far more likely that someone was cheating or messing with the game than it was they hit the right number 100,000 times in a row just by luck. And in the same way, scientists and mathematicians can calculate the odds of things happening they've never seen before, like what is the probability of the fine-tuning of the universe happening the way that it did.
Cosmological constant needs to be set to 1 part in a trillion, 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 trillion.
This cosmological constant is tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120, 120 decimal places. Nobody thinks that's accidental. That is not a reasonable idea.
Okay, those are not very good odds for a random universe. What are the odds of a short functional protein putting itself together just by chance to construct genetic information?
So the odds of building even a short functional protein by chance alone is 74 plus 40. You can remember how you do this in math? You can add the exponents if you're multiplying exponential numbers.
164.
Thank you very much. Okay? Wow. Now, can anyone get their mind around a number that big? There's only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the entire universe. There's only 10 to the 16th seconds since the Big Bang. There's only 10 to the 139th total events since the beginning of the universe. Now you're starting to get the understanding of why people are very skeptical that the chance hypothesis is going to do the job. Has anyone ever gotten in a discussion with you about the origin of life and said, hey, it happened by chance? I mean, do you hear that? I mean, this happens to me. I'll be lecturing in hostile university environments, and I'll get done and somebody say, well, but, and they want to argue with me about the probabilities. And I just shut the discussion down because I say, no serious scientist thinks this is the way it happened. It's always going to be more probable that it didn't happen by chance than it did. And with that kind of reasoning, you realize it's time to move on and look at some other options.
Okay, those are terrible odds too, but as the author would say, we can't know that for sure, because you can't prove that. His argument of, we can't test creation, so it can't be the answer, is a very popular tactic to dismiss a creative being, because science relies on things that are observable, repeatable, and testable, which a creative intelligence is not, so therefore, it is not science and cannot be acknowledged as science, even if the evidence suggests that all other explanations are failures. This is why evolutionary theory is still the standing theory taught today, because intelligent design would be a supernatural conclusion, or God, and by the way science defines itself, no matter what the evidence says, God cannot be the answer. As Dean Kenyon puts it,
with Darwinism and neo-Darwinism and this commitment to philosophical naturalism, that the only permissible explanations in science are those that involve observable and testable natural processes. And when you move into the area of intelligent design, although you argue to intelligent design through a dense field, if you will, of empirical data, and it's only after extended encounter with those data that you come out at the end with an intelligent design conclusion, nevertheless, it makes many scientists uneasy because this is thought of, this causation, intelligent causation, as ultimately untestable by the traditional methods of science. So if you define science as excluding the possibility of intelligent cause at the outset, then any proposal that is made, however many data back it, is ruled out of court from the beginning.
So by saying we don't have another universe to test, so we don't know how improbable it is just a stall tactic. It's not a tactic that proves him right whatsoever. It's merely an attempt to avoid any conclusions at all. But when we consider the odds of all these things happening, like the improbability of the universe being finely tuned and adding the odds of a short functional protein organizing itself just by luck is 10 to the 164th power, or more particles in the entire universe, the author is saying we only have one universe, so this hasn't been observed and we can't test it, so you can't prove we're wrong, is basically the author's way of saying,
so you're telling me there's a chance?
Thus, the counter-argument goes, Swinburne and other modern teleologists are right to recognize that if things were slightly different, then life maybe wouldn't have evolved or would have evolved very differently. But that is wholly different from claiming that it's unlikely to have happened in the first place.
Okay, so he finishes off almost acknowledging that the likelihood of the universe being created the way that it is very improbable. But then he says, that is different than saying it never happened at all. It's like in a court case, when the DNA matches perfectly and the prosecution were to say, there's a 1 in 100 trillion chance that this DNA were to match exactly the way that it does. And then having the defense team say, yes, it may be unlikely, but that's wholly different than saying this is the same DNA, because you can't prove for certain we just didn't get lucky. This entire video only has one objection, which is, you can't prove that. Neither side is going to be able to prove their side is 100% correct. But when faced with decisions like these, we weigh all the evidence and see if one side outweighs the other. But when we do that, the conclusion is very clear, that the universe is made by design. When choosing sides between a random, unguided universe that just ended up perfectly by luck versus the argument that the universe is organized because it was designed, one must choose which side makes more sense. That randomness and chance creates consistent, repeatable laws, intricate designs, and highly complex coding systems, that chaos creates organization, that non-intelligence creates intelligence, and that non-life creates life just by chance, even against the insurmountable odds. Or is it more sensible to recognize that we don't live in a random world? We live in a world of cause and effect, not random chaos. We live in a universe of laws, of structures, of organization. We, as humans, use intricate design, laws, systems, structure, and coding ourselves, so we can recognize these laws, patterns, and organizations all around us, because this type of organization is not a completely foreign concept to us, and we have the capacity to do so because we have intelligent minds, and we inherited this intelligence because we are descendants of a higher intelligence that created us in his image.